The first drop was always the loudest. It hit the polished antiseptic floor of the control room with a soft, distinct tap, a perfect dark crimson circle against the impersonal gray. A second drop followed, then a third, a slow, steady leak from the fresh white bandage peeking out from beneath the crisp blue sleeve of her flight suit. Captain Eva Rostova did not flinch. She stood at a rigid parade rest, her gaze fixed on some distant point on the far wall, her face a mask of composed exhaustion. The low, respectful hum of the gathered crowd was a world away from the sounds that had put that bandage there. A two-star general, his own chest a tapestry of service, stood beside her holding a small velvet case. Inside, the distinguished flying cross gleamed under the sterile LED lights. "For exceptional valor and courage under fire," the general's voice boomed, echoing in the vast, windowless room. But Eva barely heard the official words. Her mind was thousands of miles away in a different kind of darkness, surrounded by the smell of dust, cordite, and fear. The general turned to her, his eyes reflecting a respect that went beyond mere protocol. He was honoring a pilot, but the bandage on her shoulder, the slight, almost imperceptible stiffness in her posture, told a different story. They wanted to give her the medal for her skill in the air, for the thousands of hours of flawless service rendered from the safety of this very room. But she had earned it for her courage on the ground. She had earned it the night the eye in the sky went dark. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, flashed behind her eyes. Not of this ceremony, but of chaos. The frantic red alarm blare of a system failure. The shouted acronyms, ECM, total blackout! That meant men were about to die. The feel of her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence of the lost drone feed. The image of Sergeant Miller's file photo, a grinning man with a family waiting for him, flashed in her mind. He was just a digital ghost on a screen, an objective, until he wasn't. Until he became a person she had to reach. The general was pinning the medal to her uniform now. The weight of it was insignificant compared to the weight she had carried out of that dusty compound. The polite applause of the audience washed over her. She saw her father in the front row, his back straight, his eyes glistening with a pride so profound it looked like pain. The farmer from Nebraska, the Vietnam vet who had taught her about duty and engines and the simple, unbreakable will to see a thing through. He wasn't looking at the medal. He was looking at the bandage. He understood. This was not an award for following orders. It was a testament to what happened when you had to make a choice to leave the safety of the screen and step into the messy, dangerous reality on the other side. The drone had failed, and she had gone in herself. The memory of the control room and the weight of the medal dissolved, replaced by the sharp, clear light of a Nebraska morning 20 years earlier. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel fuel. A 9-year-old Eva, her small hands already stained with grease, was buried up to her elbows in the guts of a balky John Deere tractor. Her father, Joseph, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and silence, watched from a nearby fence post, his expression unreadable. The carburetors flooded. "Dad," she announced, her voice small but certain. She wasn't guessing. She had traced the problem, a stuck float valve, with a logic that belied her age. Joseph Rostova nodded slowly, a rare smile touching the corners of his eyes. He had seen this before, this quiet, intense focus, this need to understand how things worked, to fix what was broken. "You have a gift, Eva," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You don't just see the machine, you see the connections, you see the why." He never treated her like a little girl in these moments. He spoke to her like a fellow mechanic. Later, sitting on the porch swing as the fireflies began their evening dance, he would sometimes talk about a different kind of machinery. The machinery of war. He never told grand, heroic stories. His tales were muted, painted in shades of green and fear. He spoke of the deafening roar of helicopters, the weight of a pack, the eerie silence of the jungle before an ambush. He spoke of the men beside him, their names, their quirks, the ones who didn't come home. He never said it outright, but the lesson was woven into every word, the most important lesson he ever taught her. A soldier's covenant. You look out for the person next to you. You never leave a man behind. That lesson followed her to the Air Force Academy. It was there, in a sterile lecture hall, that she first saw the Predator drone. On the screen, it was a sleek alien thing, a silent hunter in the sky. The instructor spoke of persistent stare and risk reduction. It was a revolution in warfare. A pilot could now fight a war from an air-conditioned room thousands of miles from the danger. For Ava, it was a puzzle. It was a new kind of machine to understand, a new set of connections to master. She aced the simulations, her mind effortlessly mapping the lag between command and action, the physics of flight, the patterns of life on the ground. She became one of the first and the best in her drone pilot class. She would call home every Sunday. Her father, now older, his back a little more bent from a lifetime of working the land, would listen. "It's not like your war, Dad," she said once, trying to explain the strange disconnect of her new role. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only by the faint static of the distance between them. "Isn't it?" he finally replied, his voice gentle. "You're still watching over soldiers. You're still keeping them safe. The uniform is different. The machine is different. The duty is the same." He had given her a reason that went beyond the thrill of technology or the path of a career. He had given her a purpose. She wasn't just operating a remote-controlled plane. She was a guardian. She was the silent, unseen eye ensuring that other fathers, other brothers, made it home. It was a heavy responsibility, a connection she felt to every pixelated figure she saw moving through her screen. They were not just assets. They were someone's everything, and she was their lifeline, a connection stretching from the quiet farmlands of Nebraska to the dust-choked battlefields of a world away. The sterile, air-conditioned briefing room was a world away from the dusty memories of Nebraska. Captain Eva Rostova stood before a large digital map, its glow reflecting in the calm, focused eyes of the soldiers seated before her. These were not recruits. They were hardened operators, members of an elite special forces team. Their faces were grim, their postures radiating a coiled energy. At the center of their attention was a photograph of a man with a weathered, kind face, Sergeant First Class David Miller. At 0400 local time, Sergeant Miller's embedded training team was ambushed near the village of Koskel. Eva began, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense silence. She clicked a small remote, and the map zoomed in on a satellite image of a walled compound nestled in a rugged valley. "We believe he and 2 of his men are being held here." A laser pointer danced across the screen, a tiny red dot tracing the outlines of buildings. "This is the primary structure. Intel suggests it's a temporary holding site. Their window for extraction is small, 12 hours at most, before they're moved deeper into insurgent territory." She changed the slide. The screen now showed a live, high-altitude feed from the Siren drone. The image was breathtakingly clear. They could see figures moving in the courtyard, the shadow of a guard leaning against a wall. "The Siren drone will provide continuous real-time surveillance," Eva continued. "Its sensors can see through most forms of conventional camouflage and track heat signatures through roofing material. Our mission is to maintain this watch, identify all hostile combatants, and pinpoint the exact location of our personnel. Once we have positive ID and a clear pattern of life, your team will be inserted here." The red dot moved to a landing zone 2 clicks from the compound. A large man with a master sergeant's rank and a beard that bordered on regulations scoffed quietly, not at her, but at the situation. "So we sit here and wait for the camera to tell us when to go get our guy?" Master Sergeant Cole's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. He looked directly at Ava, his gaze appraising. "No offense, Captain. It's just a different kind of war. We're used to having eyes on the ground, not just up there." He gestured vaguely at the ceiling, representing the distant, unseen drone. Eva met his gaze without flinching. She understood his skepticism. To him, she was a technician, a video game player who would clock out and go home while his team risked everything. "The Siren's eyes are better than any ground team's, Master Sergeant," she replied, her tone respectful but firm. "It sees the whole chessboard, not just one square. It will see the patrol you can't. It will see the IED you might miss. My job is to make sure you have every possible advantage before you step off that helicopter." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Sergeant Miller and his men are counting on us. On all of us." She clicked the remote again, and the screen split, showing the live drone feed on one side and the personnel files of the 3 captured soldiers on the other. They were no longer just names or grainy images. They were a team, a family. They were the reason this room was filled with such grim purpose. The plan was set. It was clean, it was surgical, and it was entirely dependent on the unblinking eye in the sky, an eye that Eva Rostova controlled from the safety of a room halfway across the world. For now, the only sound was the quiet hum of the projector and the shared, heavy silence of men waiting for a signal to risk it all. The control room was a cathedral of quiet concentration. The only sounds were the whisper of the climate control and the soft tapping of keyboards. Eva sat in her leather pilot's chair, her hands resting lightly on the control stick and throttle. On the main screen in front of her, the live feed from the siren drone was a study in stillness. The compound in the valley of Kaskel baked under the afternoon sun. A single guard shuffled lazily across the courtyard. It was a picture of mundane routine, a scene that belied the life and death tension in the Nevada control room. "Marker 1, confirmed guard, east wall," Eva said, her voice calm in her headset microphone. A digital tag appeared on the screen, tracking the man's movement. "Marker 2, stationary target, main building roof. Possible sniper position." Her eyes never left the screen, absorbing every detail, every pixel. She was building a pattern of life, a digital blueprint of the enemy's habits. In her mind, she was already inside those walls, tracing the path she would take, the shadows she would use. Master Sergeant Cole and his team were suiting up in the next room, their muted chatter a low rumble over the comms. They were putting their faith in her eyes. Then, without the slightest warning, the image on the screen dissolved. One moment, it was a crystal-clear view of a dusty courtyard. The next, it was a seething, chaotic mess of green and black static. A harsh, blaring alarm shattered the silence of the control room. "We have a total systems failure!" A systems technician yelled, his voice pitched high with panic. "Massive targeted ECM burst! It's swamping all our frequencies! We've lost siren!" The live feed was gone. The digital tags vanished. The compound, the guards, Sergeant Miller, they had all just disappeared into a cloud of electronic noise. The eye in the sky had been blinded. In the sudden void, the mission was crumbling. The clean surgical plan was now a suicide run. Cole's voice, tight and angry, crackled over the comms. "Control, what is happening?" "We have no feed!" "Say again, we are blind." Eva's commander, Colonel Jensen, was at her station, his face ashen. "We can't get it back, Eva. The jamming is too powerful. It's a complete blackout." He slammed his hand on the console. "The mission is a scrub. We can't send them in blind." The words hung in the air. A scrub. It was the safe call, the logical call. But it was a death sentence for Miller and his men. Eva's mind raced. She saw the satellite image of the compound burned onto the back of her eyelids. She saw the guard patrol routes, the weak points in the outer wall, the back alleys she had mentally marked as an infiltration route. She had studied it for 72 hours. She knew it better than the streets around her own base. She stood up. The movement was smooth, deliberate. The panic in the room seemed to part around her. All eyes turned to her. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a terrifying calm. Colonel Jensen stared at her. "What is it, Captain?" Eva's gaze was unwavering. She looked from the colonel's desperate face to the blank, static-filled screen that had been her window to the world. "Sir, I have the compound's layout memorized. Every door, every window, every blind spot. My combat controller certification is current. I am qualified for direct ground operations." She took a slow breath, the words feeling both impossible and utterly inevitable. "You can't send the team in blind." "So send me." The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the relentless, mocking hiss of the static on the main screen. The drone had failed. She would go in herself. The roar of the C-130's engines was a physical force, a deafening vibration that shook Eva to her bones. It was nothing like the quiet hum of the control room. Here everything was raw, visceral, and loud. Strapped into a canvas seat, she was just another piece of cargo in the darkened belly of the plane, surrounded by the shadowy figures of the quick reaction force that would follow her initial signal. The air smelled of jet fuel, sweat, and metal. A jumpmaster gave her a thumbs up, his face grim in the red interior light. This was really happening. The green light flashed on. The ramp at the rear of the plane lowered, revealing a yawning chasm of swirling, ink-black night. The wind howled, trying to tear everything not tied down into the void. This was the point of no return. With a final deep breath that filled her lungs with the cold, thin air, Ava launched herself into the darkness. The force of the slipstream snatched at her, tumbling her for a heart-stopping second before her parachute deployed with a reassuring, violent jerk. Suddenly, the world was silent, save for the whisper of the wind in her rigging lines. She was alone. Utterly, profoundly alone. The digital certainty of her screens was gone, replaced by the vast, unknowable landscape below. The comforting weight of her rifle, the solid feel of her gear. It was all real now. She guided her descent, aiming for a small patch of scrubland she had identified from the satellite imagery. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she hit it with a practiced rolling impact, quickly gathering her chute. The silence was deafening. It was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful bark of a dog. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of the wind through the dry grass was a potential threat. She moved off the landing zone, her training taking over. She was a ghost, a shadow flitting from one piece of cover to the next. Her world shrank to the next rock, the next ditch, the next 100 meters. The mental map in her head was her only guide. She thought of her father's stories, not of grand battles, but of the long, terrifying walks through the Vietnamese jungle, the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes watching you. She finally understood the weight he had carried, a weight no drone pilot was ever supposed to feel. This was the human cost, the terrifying reality behind the clean digital lines on a screen. It took her 2 hours to reach the outskirts of the village. The compound wall loomed ahead, a dark, imposing silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. This was it. The back alley she had memorized was there, just as the satellite image had promised. Slipping into the narrow, refuse-strewn passage, she felt a strange sense of detachment. She had looked down on this very alley from 8,000 miles away. Now, she was standing in its filth, the smell of rot and decay filling her nostrils. This was the connection between the digital and the real, and she was the fragile link. Pressing herself against the cold, rough stone of the outer wall, she pulled a grapnel hook from her pack. The mission was no longer a video feed. It was here, in the silence and the shadows, waiting for her on the other side of this wall. The inside of the compound was a labyrinth of deeper shadows and unsettling quiet. Ava moved with a predator's patience, her every sense stretched to its limit. The mental map in her head was her only guide, and she followed it with absolute trust, flitting from the cover of a rusted truck to the darkness pooled beside a low storage shed. The guard she had seen from the drone feed was gone, likely seeking shelter from the night's chill. The silence was a living thing, heavy and watchful. Then she heard it, a low rhythmic sound, a faint scraping like a boot shifting on a gritty floor. It was coming from a low, windowless building tucked against the far wall, the structure she had tagged as the most probable holding cell. She approached the heavy wooden door, noting the modern heavy-duty padlock that secured it. This was it. Kneeling, she pulled a small, specialized toolkit from her vest. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, not from the war, but from the farm. Precision, Ava, it's not about force. It's about feeling the mechanism, listening to it. Her hands, which had once fixed a tractor's carburetor, now worked with the same deliberate care on the lock. There was a series of faint metallic clicks, a final, satisfying snick, and the lock fell open in her hand. She pushed the door inward just enough to slip through. The air inside was thick and foul, smelling of unwashed bodies and fear. 3 figures huddled in the gloom, their hands bound. The man in the center looked up, his face a mask of bruises and exhaustion. It was Sergeant Miller. His eyes, dull with resignation, widened in pure, unadulterated shock. He squinted, trying to process the apparition before him. A lone figure, not one of Cole's burly operators, but a woman with a face he had only ever seen on a video monitor during mission briefings. "Captain?" he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse and dehydration. "The drone pilot?" The other two soldiers stirred, their own faces mirroring the same impossible hope. Eva was already moving, her knife slicing through their plastic restraints with efficient strokes. "The drone failed," she said, her voice low and steady. There was no time for explanations, no time for relief. "We have a narrow exfil window. Can you walk?" Miller rubbed his raw wrists, a spark of the old fire returning to his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the dirt smudged on her face, the focused intensity in her gaze, the absolute professionalism in her movements. This was not the remote, detached officer from the briefing room. This was a soldier who had walked through hell to get to them. The skepticism, the unspoken doubt about the video game player evaporated, replaced by a respect that was bone-deep and instant. "We can run if we have to, Captain," he said, his voice gaining strength. He was no longer just a rescued asset. He was a member of her team now, and she had just proven herself in the only way that truly mattered, here on the ground. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She had not just located them, she had reached them, and in doing so, had forged a bond of trust in the dark that would never be broken. The night air felt clean and sharp after the stifling confines of the cell. Ava led the three rescued soldiers through the shadows, retracing her path with a grim certainty. Miller and his men moved with the quiet discipline of professionals, their footsteps barely a whisper on the hard-packed earth. Hope was a tangible force now, a current pulling them toward the extraction point on the outskirts of the village. They were almost there. The distant, rhythmic thumping of the approaching Black Hawk helicopter was the most beautiful sound Eva had ever heard, a promise of salvation beating against the night sky. Then a shout ripped through the darkness, sharp and guttural. A door slammed open, spilling yellow light into the alley ahead. An insurgent, fumbling with his rifle, stood frozen for a second, his eyes wide with surprise. The element of surprise was gone, shattered in an instant. Eva didn't hesitate. "Contact front," she yelled, raising her own weapon and firing 2 controlled rounds. The man dropped, but the damage was done. More shouts echoed, lights flicked on in surrounding buildings. The quiet compound erupted into a hornet's nest of activity. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from a window, the sharp crack of AK-47s splitting the air. Rounds snapped past them, kicking up puffs of dust at their feet. "Move! Move!" Miller yelled, pushing his weaker men forward as he returned fire. They broke into a sprint, a desperate dash for the waiting helicopter that had now flared, its wheels touching down in a cloud of dust and debris. The crew chief leaned out, waving them frantically forward. They were so close. Ava provided covering. Fire, spraying short, disciplined bursts toward the windows to keep the enemy's heads down. One of Miller's men stumbled, and the sergeant grabbed him, hauling him the last few meters toward the open bay door. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Eva's shoulder. The force of the impact spun her halfway around. It felt like she'd been struck by a sledgehammer. Gritting her teeth against a wave of nausea, she forced herself to stay upright to keep firing. Her left arm hung useless, a warm, sticky wetness already soaking through her sleeve. The covenant her father had taught her, the one she had lived by from the control room, now screamed in her mind. No one gets left behind. Miller and his 2 men were in the helicopter now. The crew chief was reaching for her. But the enemy fire was intensifying, rounds pinging off the Black Hawk's armored skin. They couldn't stay on the ground. "Go!" Ava screamed over the roaring chaos, her voice raw. "Get them out! Now!" She turned her back to the helicopter, planting her feet, and unleashed a final furious volley toward the compound, a lone figure laying down a storm of cover. The crew chief, his face a mask of anguish, gave a sharp signal to the pilot. The Black Hawk lifted, its skids clearing the ground. It rose into the night, climbing away from the deadly intersection, the lives of 3 men secured inside its belly. Ava stood alone in the maelstrom, the last rounds in her magazine spent, the echoes of her sacrifice ringing in the deafening silence she left behind. The world dissolved into a haze of pain and roaring noise. With her weapon empty and the fire now concentrated solely on her, Ava knew she had mere seconds. Gritting her teeth against the agony in her shoulder, she turned and sprinted for the cover of a low stone wall at the edge of the landing zone. Rounds impacted the ground around her, stitching a line of dust puffs at her heels. She dove behind the wall just as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the spot where she had been standing moments before. The concussion wave battered her, ringing her ears and filling her mouth with the taste of dirt and cordite. She was pinned down, alone, and bleeding. The triumphant shouts of the insurgents closing in were louder now. This was the cost. This was the reality. She thought of her father, hoping he would understand. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. It was the heavy, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a minigun. Tracer fire, brilliant lines of green light streaked down from the sky, hammering into the compound's outer walls, silencing the enemy guns in a storm of shredded concrete and metal. Eva looked up. The Black Hawk had not fled. It had banked hard in a wide, aggressive turn, and was now coming back for her. Master Sergeant Cole's voice, calm and fierce, crackled over the radio she thought was dead. "Hold your position, Guardian Angel. We're not leaving you." The helicopter flared above her, its downdraft whipping up a blinding storm of dust and debris. A fast rope dropped, snaking down beside her. "Now, Captain! Now!" the crew chief yelled, his arm outstretched. Summoning the last of her strength, Ava grabbed the rope with her good arm, hooking her boots around it. The Black Hawk lifted violently, hauling her up into the air. Strong hands grabbed her vest, pulling her unceremoniously into the safety of the bay. As they peeled away, the minigun continued to roar, a final devastating message to those below. Weeks later, back in the sterile, blue-lit control room, the memory of that dust and noise felt like a dream. Captain Ava Rostova stood at a rigid parade rest, the crisp fabric of her dress uniform straining against the bandage on her shoulder. The distinguished flying cross felt cool and heavy against her chest. The general's words echoed, speaking of conspicuous gallantry and valor beyond the call of duty. But her eyes were not on the general. They scanned the audience, past the senior officers and the flashing cameras, and found the faces of Sergeant Miller, Master Sergeant Cole, and his entire team, all sitting ramrod straight, their expressions filled with a respect that needed no words. Then her gaze settled on her father. He stood beside her mother, his back straight, his eyes glistening. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was the same nod he'd given her when she'd fixed that tractor so many years ago. A recognition of a job done right, of a problem solved, of a duty fulfilled. Later, after the ceremony had ended and the crowd had dispersed, Ava found herself alone in the quiet control room. The screens were dark now, the hum of the computers a soft lullaby. She looked at her reflection in the blank black glass of the main monitor. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight stiffness in her posture. The technology was a marvel, a tool of immense power. But it could fail. It could be blinded. The drone had failed. But the human spirit, the courage, to cross from the virtual to the real, the willingness to sacrifice for the person next to you, that could not be jammed, that could not be hacked. Captain Eva Rostova, the drone pilot who became the boots on the ground, had proven that the most vital component in any mission, the true guardian angel, was the unwavering human heart.